Thank you to everybody here again for joining us. We're going to be talking about the psychosocial regulations. So this is the new and updated regulations that came into play in New South Wales and Queensland last year. They will be launching in Victoria this year at some point, but for now we'll be talking predominantly about New South Wales and Queensland. Now, I have to admit, when I first heard about these psychosocial regulations, I felt completely overwhelmed. And had a bit of a mini freak out when I started looking at all the information. There was a lot to get your head around, lots of different information, and I actually felt quite concerned for some of our clients about how they were going to start implementing some of these changes that need to happen. But the more and more that I listened and I learned and I read and I started to understand what these regulations actually mean, it's an absolute game changer. And I think for organisations that can really get this right, and actually we have to get this right now, it's really going to put that whole human sustainability piece at the forefront. We've always looked at physical safety, but now we really need to look at mental health and well-being. And the new psychosocial regulations absolutely honour this. So yes, lots to get your head around, but once we get this right, it's going to be an absolute game changer for us all. So, I am going to introduce, I'd also like to acknowledge there are people in the room who are at different stages on the journey around psychosocial regulations. Some people, this might be the first time you're hearing about them. For others, you might be much more further along the process and the journey. So just bear with us when we go through a bit of a recap of what these regulations are. And Lisa is going to start doing that for us. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Lisa. So Lisa is the director of Henry William Lawyers, which is a boutique commercial law firm. She's a workplace law specialist for longer than she cares to count, advising some of Australia's best-known businesses, acting as a strategic partner to corporate clients across a wide range of industries. Her work includes advising, supporting, and working with her clients across all aspects of the employment life cycle, and guiding and collaborating with leaders to preempt and minimise risk. In the work, health, and safety area, Lisa works with clients to implement and maintain compliant work, health, and safety frameworks, guides them in dealing with the regulators, very helpful, negotiates enforceable undertakings and defends prosecutions. Recently, in particular, Lisa has been assisting clients implement systems that take into account newly introduced proactive duties in relation to sexual harassment and psychosocial health and safety, which she will talk about today. James introduced me to Lisa in 2017 after I read an article she wrote about employee well-being, and calling employers to take a proactive approach to employee well-being and mental health. And the synergy between what we were doing has led us to work together with clients in the psychosocial health space. Welcome today, Lisa. And welcome to James, who is the principal of Stanford Brown, which is a private wealth advisory firm. He has over 20 years' experience in the financial services industry, specialising in employee benefits. And is a leading life insurance matter subject expert. James works with employers to design, implement and manage innovative benefits and wellbeing strategies, supporting employees' physical, mental and financial wellbeing. Working with some of the world's largest employers, a few of them are in the room today, across a range of industries, including technology, banking, media and manufacturing. James has a passion for the promotion of financial literacy and is a strong believer that providing financial well-being support in the workforce can result in meaningful employee experiences, enhancing their broader well-being. With the recent changes to work health and safety regulations, James and his team are expanding existing methods for consulting with employees to receive feedback firsthand on the risks they face, as well as how to integrate this with their broader benefits and well-being strategies, to provide ongoing, proactive and preventative measures to support the work, health and safety framework. And our last panel member, who I know very well, because I get to work with her every single day for the last 7 years, is my business partner in crime, Martine from Select Wellness. And Select Wellness advises on design, and Select Wellness advises and designs and delivers mental health and wellbeing services to a diverse range of Australian companies. Martine started her career a long way away from wellbeing, but maybe not so far from assessing psychosocial risks as an underwriter and senior manager in the reinsurance industry, whilst also studying law. After the birth of her eldest son, she retrained as a psychotherapist and later as an executive coach. For over 20 years now, Martine has been in private practice and supports the mental well-being of her clients, ranging from parolees to teenagers and CEOs. In her work with Select, Martine is recognised for her ability to use the learnings from her keen interest in neuro and behavioural science to design practical programs that protect the mental well-being of employees from the harms of long-term stress, heavy workloads and busy lives. We're now going to kick off the panel, and Lisa is going to take you through some of the regulations of the code.
Thank you, Camilla. So I might just need to change the glasses for this. I'm going to try and talk to you, I'm going to try and condense a fairly complex topic into 10, 12 minutes. So I have got some notes for those of you who know me, know I talk too much. Hopefully the notes will keep me on track. So I get to do the dull bit, the dull but necessary bit. And we're doing this first up after you've had something to eat before you go into that sort of food coma and fall asleep. So what I want to do is to basically, at the outset, set out the legal framework for you so that you've got some context around psychosocial hazards in the workplace and how it all fits together. And I know, as Camilla said, there are varying degrees of knowledge amongst those of you in the audience. Some of you are work health and safety experts or work in that particular space in your organisations, and others of you probably haven't really heard much about this before. So for those of you who do know, just bear with me while I run through sort of the overview, because I think it's important for everyone to contextualise why this is significant. I can't promise you'll leave with all the answers today, although hopefully in the panel discussion we'll be able to get a few ideas and a few things happening. But I do think that you'll leave today with a better understanding at least of what this all means. So why are we here? Well, across Australia there are what is known as model work health and safety laws. And the practicality of that really just means that most jurisdictions have similar work health and safety laws. There are some nuances from state to state, so bear that in mind if you are operating in different states, but generally same sort of laws. And the work health and safety legislation across Australia requires persons conducting a business or undertaking, i.e. organisations, so we'll interchange that terminology, PCBU or organisations, to ensure the health and safety of their workers so far as reasonably practicable. So health and safety does mean both physical and mental health and safety. We've definitely seen an increase in psychological health and safety issues in the workplace in recent years, and various reports into mental health, including Productivity Commission report not so long ago, and also late last year, the World Health Organisation report. But the main catalyst to these work health and safety regulations goes back to 2019 when Marie Boland, who was a former Executive Director of WorkSafe South Australia, Safe Work South Australia, was tasked with reviewing the then work health and safety laws which have been in place since about 2011, and just to work out their effectiveness. So after an extensive review, she did find, amongst other things, that psychological health and safety was not being given the same priority or the same prominence as physical health and safety, and that something needed to be done about that. So she made some recommendations which included introducing regulations for protection of psychological health and safety as a priority. Another recommendation which is interesting and has some relevance to today too is she recommended creating an industrial manslaughter offence, which has sort of largely happened in most jurisdictions. And when that was introduced in Victoria specifically, there was a direct statement about the connection to manslaughter offences and workplace psychological harm. I don't really have a lot of time to talk much about all that today, but if anyone is interested, needs any more information, available to contact later on. So moving on to 2022, what we saw was that New South Wales led the charge by introducing the regulations for the protection of psychosocial health and safety. And it introduced this code basically to assist organisations in dealing with psychosocial risk in their workplaces. Because what they found, the regulator found, was that there's certainly no guidance for organisations, really, there was no comprehensive guidance, so the code includes that comprehensive guidance. But because of their lack of guidance, most organisations didn't have systems and frameworks in place to deal with psychological health and safety issues. So the new regulations and the code use the term psychosocial. So basically that is the interaction between psychological factors and the surrounding social environment, and the effect these factors have on physical and mental well-being. So the panel and I will talk more about psychosocial hazards, but for the moment keep in mind that psychosocial hazards at work are aspects of work and situations that may cause a stress response, which can in turn lead to psychological or physical harm. So it's not just psychological harm. I've got a slide later on which lists some of the physical harm aspects too that might be a side effect of psychosocial hazards. So continuing with the theme of dull, I'm going to just talk about the legal framework for you a little bit. Set it out. This is really because I think it's important for you to know that we're dealing with a criminal jurisdiction here, and a lot of people who work in HR, who are work health and safety experts in their organisations, still sometimes struggle to get leadership buy-in. So to me, this is sort of a big stick, right? It is a criminal jurisdiction. The overarching legislation is the Work Health and Safety Act, so that'll differ, as I said, from state to state. The Work Health and Safety regulations underpin or supplement the Act, and the regulations, also have legal force, so they operate alongside the Act. And then we have the codes of practice, which you've heard me bandy around a little bit, and they are approved codes, so they're approved by the regulators, so there's Work Health and Safety regulators in each state, and they do provide important practical guidance on how you might achieve compliance with your duties and obligations under the legislation and the regulations. So really the regulations provide very little guidance, so that's why we have the code. So I think what's important to note about the code is that you won't be prosecuted for a breach of the code, but if you are prosecuted for a breach of the Act, then the code can be used as evidence in court proceedings for the court to have regard to what was the known risk, what were the known control measures, those sorts of things. So what was the standard that you should have achieved? So you won't be prosecuted for that breach, but really, what it means is it sets the minimum bar. So I think ultimately, you do need to have regard to the code. I would say to everyone, have a good read of the code and set that as your minimum standard. So Camilla just mentioned New South Wales. The code is in New South Wales. The code is also in Western Australia. It started on Christmas Eve, and effective 1 April this year, the code will be Commonwealth and the Queensland codes will come into effect. Victoria is also proposing new regulations, but the key difference between Victoria and the other states is that the Victorian laws will require written prevention plans and biannual reporting obligations on employers with more than 50 employees in relation to complaints. And at the end of the slides, I've got a big ugly penalty chart. That's not enough to get your top line people interested. There's a big ugly penalty chart at the end. And just going along with that theme of getting everybody on board, so we've got the organisation has the obligation, the positive obligation, and it does extend beyond just the workplace. It extends to protecting workers from harm from third parties, so your contractors, your customers, people in your supply chain. Workers have their own duties to, fulfil these obligations and to comply with work health and safety directions and policies and procedures. But also your directors and officers have standalone due diligence obligations to make sure that the organisation is doing what it needs to do to comply with its duties. When I say standalone, I use that word because I mean that if an organisation does not have to be prosecuted for a director or an officer to be prosecuted. They can be separate prosecutions of those people if they've breached their duties. So they need to know what this all means and how that impacts on what their duties are. Again, that's another talk, but so we get in front of boards and we explain to directors and officers what their due diligence obligations are. We don't really have a lot of time to go through it today, but there is some stuff in the code that will help you as well. And again, let me know if we can send some stuff through. So I just wanted to go back to the basic concepts, which will, I think, help you work out what you're dealing with here. So hazard, risk and control are the basic concepts really. So hazard, when we say psychosocial hazard, something that could potentially cause harm. It could also be physical hazard. A risk, it's the possibility that of harm which may occur when exposed to that hazard. And then the control is what sort of measures would you put in place to firstly eliminate the hazard, because that's your primary duty. But if that's not practicable, then to minimise the risk. So in terms of psychosocial hazard, that's actually defined in the in the code, and this is directly lifted from the code. So it just talks about what a psychosocial hazard is. So it is a hazard which relates to either the design or management of work, a working environment, the plant at the workplace. You might have loud, noisy operation, machines operating, backcourt triggers a response in someone. And it also includes workplace interactions and behaviours which may cause psychological harm. And I intentionally use the word may because it does not have to be an injury. It does not have to result in, if we're dealing with physical injury, it doesn't have to result in a physical injury, you don't have to result in a psychological injury. It's the potential, it's the risk, it's the potential to cause the harm. Now, we're dealing with risk-based legislation, so you have to identify what the hazards are and put measures in place to deal with those risks. The code also has some examples of common psychosocial hazards, and we'll talk a bit more about that in an interactive way in the panel. What I would point you to as well, even if you're only based in New South Wales, have a look at the Queensland Code too. There's a fair bit of information in that about and some examples of psychosocial hazards in there as well. And they're the harm that I mentioned earlier on. So I think the thing I got out of the code, which I thought was the most helpful, is this risk management process, this chart. Bear in mind, consultation on the outside all the way through, because you have duties to consult with workers, with other duty holders, with other stakeholders who might be impacted throughout this whole process. So even when you're identifying your hazards, you've got an obligation to consult. You've got an obligation when you're looking at the risk to consult, when you're looking at control measures to consult, and then later on when you have to assess whether your control measures are effective, also obligations to consult there. Really, your first step is identifying the hazards. So you need to be cognizant of individual workers' needs and situations. And what isn't a hazard in one person may be a hazard for another. Some means to identifying hazards do include consulting with workers, but you can observe the workplace, you can review and collect information, so you might have some data already available, say incident reports. One I think probably, and the panel might talk about this a bit more too, is one significant way of working through what hazards are and identifying hazards is to do surveys for staff. Pretty important. And then have a look at your other data on leave, staff turnover, absenteeism, and have a look at your workplace policies and procedures when you're going through that as well. So once you've done that, your next step is to go to 2, and that's to assess the risks. So think about all of the psychosocial risks rather than just each risk on its own. Consider the frequency and the duration of exposure to the psychosocial hazards, and then how those hazards may interact. So the more psychosocial hazards that are present, the more likely there is for harm to occur. Third step is to implement your control measures. And we'll probably have a bit of a chat about that because that's where people go, well, what kind of control measures should I be implementing? Again, the codes are pretty good at giving some examples, but it's not exhaustive. So you need to either eliminate or reduce, as I've said. If you can't, it's not reasonably practical to eliminate. And it won't be possible to eliminate everything. When we start talking about some of the hazards, you go, oh, how do we address that in any way? So that's really important to know. But and I think the other thing is that the appropriate controls, even though there are examples in the codes, they're going to vary from each workplace, and they're also going to sometimes vary between different work groups, different teams, different individuals in the workplace. And the final step that I mentioned before I wrap up and we move into the panel session is that you need to proactively maintain, monitor and review the effectiveness of the control measures and the hazards that may exist. So this element also includes responding to reports of any risks or incidents. It includes investigating any risks or incidents. So shout out to investigators here. It's going to be an area where I think there's going to be a significant amount of utilisation of investigators required here. If you're going to use internal investigators as opposed to external investigators, people need to be trained how to deal with these types of investigations. Because the people who are doing your physical investigations may not be the right people to be conducting investigations into psychological harm. They may be, but it's probably going to require some training to get them to that point. And then also you need to maintain appropriate records. Always maintain lots of records. If the regulator comes knocking, that's your records are your friend. And consider implementing a risk register. Certainly from Government of Victoria, you're going to probably have to do that to comply with the nuances in the Victorian legislation. So it's not a set and forget obligation. You need to have a living system. You've got to have a framework in place that not only considers workers throughout their employment or their engagement, but also the changing risks and hazards in your workplace. So what you do now may not be appropriate down the track. If you're going through, for example, change in an organisation, you might be going through restructuring, you might be going through merger, sale, you need to consider what the impact of that is going to be on workers as well. So it's really not something that you can just set and forget about. So I think you can see, the focus has really shifted from individual mental health to a much more systemic and holistic approach. And we'll talk about that a bit more. I've given you it in a nutshell slide, just so that that's kind of like the key takeouts. If you remember nothing else other than, gee, Lisa was dull talking about the legal stuff, just think about that. And then, of course, this is the get the leaders on board, costs of non-compliance, and the nasty chart follows. This is a New South Wales chart, by the way, so it's different in each state. But we're looking at significant penalties for breaches of work health and safety legislation. Thank you.
Is this per person? Sorry, Lisa, just going back. Is that going back to that? So the fines there.
How do they work? So it'll be. So you've got. It can apply to the PCBU, the body corporate. You can apply to the individuals. So that could be either, an individual officer, partner, whatever, of the organisation, and also to the actual workers. Okay. So if you do something that is going to jeopardise the health and safety of one of your co-workers, for example, then you could be charged individually. That's individually, right. And we have seen that in the physical space. You do see co-workers get charged. I wouldn't say it's common, but it certainly does happen. So they are really significant penalties, and yes, it's per breach.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. Over to you.
I promise Lisa will swap the next presentation.
I'll do the exciting.
I'll do the dull bit. Not that this is that exciting. modelling, but what my task is to take the legislation and bring it to life from a practical considerations perspective. So carrying on from the shock and awe of the penalties, or I might do this instead. Yep. This is another shock and awe model here that Deloitte's put together. So Deloitte's put this modelling together, and it's for a company that has 250 employees, and they modelled how much time it would take for each employee, which is 2.5 hours, 500,000 estimated average annual cost of compliance. But to me, this is the big number, let's call it 1,100 hours of management effort required per organisation in the first year. So you can see if you've got, someone in HR who's driving this, or P&C or OH&S, you're just not going to get it done. You need to get the buy-in of your board and your ELT to make this work. And if you cast your mind back to that slide Lisa had, where it showed the sort of risk identification assessment, right in the middle of that was management commitment. So that's in the code of practice. It's what the regulator expects. So really crucial to engage your board and your ELT. Let's see if I can get this to work. So other things to consider. I'm not going to be able to cover everything that you need to consider, but I want to start with a mindset. What mindset do you apply to enacting this? So check your mindset. When you think about compliance, are you feeling overwhelmed and hopeless? Are you overly focused on what it's going to cost, how many hours it's going to take? Are you viewing compliance as a box-ticking exercise? Or thinking that it is just going to be the responsibility of somebody else in your organisation? So that's the mindset we don't want to bring to this. The mindset we do want to bring is we want to think beyond our compliance duty. We want to get to what I call our ethical duty. Feeling hopeful, thinking positively. I loved Camilla's description about the proven game-changing potential, the benefits that will flow to your employees, your organisation, and as a consequence, the community, by genuinely doing everything you can using an organisation-wide systemic approach to eliminate the impact of psychosocial hazards in your employees' physical and mental health. So in an ideal world, and I've actually read some studies from, of course, Scandinavia, where people have gone to work and they've left work feeling better than when they got there. Something to aim for. So the planning process, the code of practice mentions you have to have a comprehensive plan. So a few things to consider in doing this. I recommend that everybody do a gap analysis first, because there's probably a lot of policies, systems, processes, benefits, programs that actually in some way map into this new legislation. Not all of them well, but it's well worth going and doing that gap analysis to begin with. Establish a planning committee. So that needs to include stakeholders from every part of the business, because when you're even identifying the risks, you need that intel from people who are actually on the ground in those areas of the business, rather than just someone who is imagining what they might be. And every stage of that risk management process, I think these multiple stakeholders need to be consulting on. You also may need to outsource or build your resources internally. You might not have all the expertise that you need to do this, whether it's program management, the legal expertise, or the expertise in mental health and psychosocial risks and how to best eliminate them. So think about what you might need to bring in or what you might need to outsource. Pros and cons. So a lot of what I've been reading is saying OHS are really well equipped to take a lead role in this space. And they are, because they have that risk management approach already when it comes to that. The negative is a lot of people in OHS are really trained to focus on physical hazards. They don't have that training in mental health and psychosocial risks. So just be wary of that, that if OHS are going to be taking that lead, that they be aware that they really need to get some of that mental health expertise on board. Documentation. Lisa already mentioned this, it's so important. The regulator will look at this documentation when assessing if you've met your obligation. God forbid they land on your doorstep, but if they do, the first thing they're going to look for is your documentation. So you need to document every step in the risk management process. You know, not just your controls and whether they worked, but every aspect. So make sure also that what you document and the processes that you document are actually followed. Lisa had a really interesting case, she might tell us about it later, where there was a company that was heavily penalised because they had this great, I think, what sort of process was it? What was the, helping people who'd been exposed to trauma, but they didn't follow it for someone who'd been exposed ongoing to trauma, and I think that company paid a fairly sizable fine for not doing that. Consult and engage with employees right from the get-go. And at every stage of the management process, there is that duty to consult that covers every part of this process. So make it an inclusive journey. You know, announce it at your town hall. Hey, there's new legislation coming in. We're going to revolutionise how we work and improve everybody's experience at work. And get them playing their part and feeling that sense of you're on this journey together and everyone's got a mutual obligation. Remember, different employees have different obligations. So Lisa went through a couple of these in one of her slides, but consider this for when you implement your training. You're going to need different training for different people who have different obligations in your organisation. How are you going to identify psychosocial hazards in your organisation? So a lot of your existing surveys are not going to do this. They might have some questions that correlate. So your wellbeing survey, your engagement survey, don't rely on those. You need to have a specific psychosocial hazard survey. There are a few out there. I've attached a whole lot of resources to this slide deck, and there's a few in there. I think there's the Safety at Work survey, which is a validated survey. We also partner with a technology company who have something that's sort of a little bit more flexible, but that's something you definitely need to consider, particularly if you're a medium to large organisation. There's an expectation that you will have quite a good assessment process. Consider known high-risk employees. So there's a lot of research out there at the moment that tells us what these known high-risk employees are, whether it's mothers coming back from maternity leave, whether it's young workers. We know there's an epidemic of mental health in Gen Z. We know anyone who's a minority in the workplace automatically is at more of a high risk. So these are the sorts of things you need to consider when you're looking at what the risks are. You also need to consider situations. You know, if someone's working remotely, we were talking about this before we came in over a sandwich. You know, for some people, working remotely is really good for their well-being because it gives them the flexibility to do what they need to do. For other people, they end up incredibly isolated. I've known a few organisations I work with where they've got young males who haven't left the house for 3 months. Uber Eats is getting a good run for its money. It's so nuanced when you're looking at these risks. Employees with known existing vulnerabilities. So if you've got employees who you know have existing, whether it be anxiety or depression, you need to actually work out controls to assist them not to further harm themselves whilst they're at work. When you assess the risk and you implement your controls for these psychosocial risks, consider, as Lisa said, the frequency, the duration and the severity. That's also something that you need to consider around controls just as much as assessing the risk. So if you think about what we've all been through with the pandemic, that was sort of a long sort of chronic stress. You'd have to say a lot of us were suffering from chronic stress, and we saw a lot of that last year with the people that we were coaching. So you'd be thinking, okay, we've been through the pandemic, what do we need to do? What does the science tells us we need to do to reinvigorate people and get people back to feeling good again? And the science, funnily enough, says it's all about human connection. Human connection and getting that sense of hope back. So, getting that narrative away from defining the problem and looking at the potential for a positive future. So that's the sort of thinking that we'll all need to start developing. What to consider with your wellbeing programs at EAP. So I just took this quote out of Safe Work Australia because I thought it was really relevant. So they believe it's important you do not adopt a health or wellbeing promotion strategy as an alternative. So whatever you're doing at the moment in the wellbeing side of things is not going to be enough. That doesn't, help you meet your, well, it will help you, but it's not going to completely mean that you meet your obligation. So yes, health, wellbeing promotion can work in conjunction, but it has to be part of this systematic approach. So EAP on its own, or even proactive wellbeing programs, are not sufficient. So you've got to link your controls, you've got to link the EAP, or whatever you're doing on the wellbeing side, you've got to link it to those known psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And EAP, one of the known psychosocial hazards is there is mental health in the workplace, so you do have to have that there as a crisis, but there's a whole lot of other psychosocial hazards that are going to need more nuanced and more proactive preventative approaches. Communicate and promote wellbeing programs in the context of managing the identified risks to participants' wellbeing. So when you're offering a wellbeing program, put it in the context of why they might need this. And I think this is really going to lead to higher engagement with wellbeing programs when we start doing this. Resources. I'm not going to take you through what they all are, but I'm going to say it's well worth looking at quite a few of these, and from the different states as well. Obviously the code of practice, all the different states, safe work areas have got incredible resources, tip sheets on suggested controls, tip sheets on sort of risk management sort of templates. As I said before, the People at Work survey, which is validated and evidence-based, they've got some really good guides for small business. I know there's people in here who are from a small business, and it must sound a bit overwhelming listening to everything, but there's some really good guides that simplify it, and you're welcome to talk to any of us as well for some good hints as to how to take this journey without overwhelming yourselves. So that's it from me. I think we're going to open to questions now. Is that right, Camilla?
Yes. Yeah. Take that back. Thank you so much, Martine and Lisa. I might turn this down a bit, actually.
Might just have to hold it a bit further away.
Okay, I didn't introduce myself. I'm so focused on introducing everybody else. I'm Camilla. I'm the co-founder, managing director of Select Wellness, and I work with Martine. So look, there's lots to get your head around just listening to Lisa and Martine talk there. I think something that's coming through quite clearly is how important this consultation period is, and really finding out what's going on in your workplace. And it's been mentioned quite a bit about the buy-in for boards and senior leaders. Lisa, how are we going to get this? Because over the last few months, we've been inviting people to this event, and a lot of senior people have said, "Oh, it's okay, so and so will come." So they're just kind of putting their head in the sand a little bit about it. So how are we going to engage? And the people in the room here that need to engage the execs, what are your recommendations?
It's often not easy in some organisations. It's a real challenge, but I think the starting point is, I think the big stick is always helpful. If we're dealing with a criminal jurisdiction here, and as a director or an officer of an organisation, you have obligations. So I think that is helpful to at least get them listening. But then I think one of the ways that we do it is that we do training sessions for boards, and that's also helpful because it gives them an opportunity, in a small board context, to get an understanding of what they need to know. I do think that over the years, and there's a couple of people here who are working in the work health and safety space, I think over the years we've seen directors and officers shift. They understand what the duties, they understand that they have duties, duties as well as the organisation. And so I think, certainly in the physical injury space, so I think it's just a move now towards, just trying to get them on board, to understand it also includes psychological. But the other thing that we've got now too, we've got proactive duties to stop sexual harassment in the workplace. So again, there's personal liabilities there. So we're just seeing a real shift of these sorts of things coming through around the same time. So it's probably not a bad idea, just to try and get in front of them and say, look, this is why we need to, as a director and as an officer, you need to have buy-in here, because you need to make sure the organisation's complying with its duties, and you also need to make sure that we're funneling adequate resources into, compliance with our duties. I mean, that, and also too, the fact that there are some cases around. Probably in this space, not a lot yet, because the codes are all very new, the regulations are very new. But last year, prior to the New South Wales code being put in place, the case you're referring to, Martine, was a case, High Court ended up handing down a decision in a case where a woman who was a lawyer working for the Office of Public Prosecutions in Victoria and dealing with quite horrific, sexual assault cases, child exploitation cases, received about $435,000 in damages. It was a negligence claim, it wasn't a work health and safety claim. But in that claim, she argued that successfully that her employer had breached its duty of care to her. So they knew, and the court said, it's obvious that this is, performing this role is fraught with, hazards. There is a risk and you need to put things in place. But this organisation actually had a trauma policy in place, so that was used against it in the fact that it was evidence of the harm being reasonably foreseeable, and in addition to that, they'd done nothing to comply with the policy. So policy sat on the shelf, and they put no steps in place to deal with this real risk. So I think there's those sorts of cases that, people go, well, our situation's different, we don't deal in that sort of stuff. But what it shows you is that if there is a foreseeable risk in your workplace, that someone is going to be harmed by the work that they're doing or the way that they're doing that work, or the environment that they're working in, then, you also have the risk of a significant damages claim.
Thanks, Lisa. James, pick on you. A lot of people are experiencing financial stress at the moment. Mortgages are going up. It's a common conversation, hot topic at the moment. How does that play into a psychosocial risk in the workplace? I'd like to have a little talk about you.
Thank you. When you're looking at the risks in the workplace, I think you've got to look at external social factors that are going to come into play. If we look at where we are in the world at the moment, you've got inflationary measures, you've got salaries not increasing to cover those, we've got interest rates that are rising, we've also got the mortgage rate cliff that's supposed to be coming, where 800,000 people are going to move from fixed interest loans to variable loans, and their loans are going to be increasing 25,000 a year in prepayments. There's going to be a significant financial stress in all our workforces, and it's going to be insurmountable by the end of the year. Now, how that will impact individuals, I think it'll be case by case, but I think it's a good opportunity for workplaces to really put some kind of support, education plans in place to try and minimise those risks to the broader framework that we've put in place today.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to pick on someone else for a moment. Dr. Ron Ehrlich, I had a wonderful conversation with you last week, and you're in the audience, and you were sharing some statistics that you've recently read around claims. I'd love for you to share them if you don't mind.
Yeah, we were talking, I was talking to, I was talking to the senior HR officer at a very large international firm based in Melbourne, and he shared with me that the average claim for a physical injury in Victoria, and I don't think it would be any different in New South Wales, is around $94,000. But most of the claims are mental health claims now, and the average claim is around $225,000. So if your EBIT is 5%, looking to motivate leaders, if your EBIT is 5%, that means you have to generate an extra $4.2 million in revenue to cover it. So that gets people's attention, and the response might be, well, my insurance policies will cover that, but then that will be then reflected in your premiums, which are a significant and ongoing cost, particularly if they're mounting. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. That kind of shocked me when I heard that last week. Martine, last question from me, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience. Martine, in what ways do you see this legislation impacting the work that Select does in the employee mental health and wellbeing space?
Just before I answer that, I just sort of chime in on the question to Lisa. So I think another way to implement or to influence the board level is to tie it to key staff retention and attracting really good staff as well. I think particularly in the younger generations, there is this human sustainability focus where they're not willing to harm themselves to the extent that some of us older ones harmed ourselves in our working careers. And they will pick and choose workplaces, not on money, but on the degree to which they genuinely manage psychosocial risks in the workplace. I think that's probably another good way there. Yes, yeah. So, but the question to me, how is it going to impact Select? I think it's going to make our work, well, what we do, easier to sell to begin with, because we all know wellbeing works. Wellbeing, when I first started work, wasn't even a word in the workplace, let alone mental health. Then all of a sudden it became an industry, and when something becomes an industry, it sort of attracts a lot of players and a lot of desire to make a return on profit. But I think what this is doing is it's really putting wellbeing through its paces and making sure that wellbeing actually addresses known psychosocial risks and does something to change them. So I'm really excited because I'm such a study junkie. I spend my weekends reading a lot of studies on wellbeing and what works and what doesn't work. I'm so excited, and finally being able to get into organisations and say, hey, I know what works. If someone's been through a high intense period of work, I know first of all how to protect them going into that and during it, and then I know also the science, the proven ways to help them recover. So yeah, I'm quite excited about what it's going to mean for our business and what it's going to mean for organisations in general.
Great, thank you. Okay, questions. Does anybody want to put a hand up and ask a question, and I will come across and give you the mic. And just stand up and introduce yourself would be good.
Hi, Linka Stanvillage from Accenture. I'm Wellbeing Ambassador and Change Management Advisory Lead. So a question to the panel. Listening to you today, what came to mind for me is the large amount of our workforce that gets up at 2-3 a.m. to jump on international calls. Obviously, Accenture is a global global consulting firm, so working across time zones is a given, but particularly then for the, I guess, vulnerable demographic of 40-plus directors who are going to be hit with these mortgage increases and who have children and already are sleepless. So how might we, do you have any idea, advise how to address the psychosocial hazard of working outside of the outside of the classical normal 9 to 5? Is that something we need to regulate? Is that part of the regulation already?
Great question, and I see it. My husband has calls at 7 a.m. in the morning and 8 o'clock at night, and I'm constantly trying to get him to look at different ways of working because it's just not sustainable. But yeah, who would like to answer this question? Over to you.
I'm champing at the bit on this one. This is obviously a psychosocial risk, and I'd say there's a fair amount of people in this room who probably experience this. And one of the issues is you do those calls in the middle of the night, but then you don't give yourself permission to go in later in the day or to check yourself out of a meeting that maybe it's not essential for you to be in, but we're all worried about how we look. And I think the more we educate employees, and particularly managers and senior leaders, on managing this as a psychosocial risk, and we model, particularly with leaders, modelling, oh, you know what, I was on a call at 8, so I'm not going to be on the morning meeting tomorrow morning. I need, a bit of recovery time, got to take some time out. And the same would apply for companies that are going into a really intense work project, whether it be a law firm working on the Royal Commission or, any similar sort of tight deadline. There's often not a lot of choice around, those high intense work periods, but we can implement recovery sort of mandates and we can equip people with ways to work at that level without doing quite the extent of harm that they normally would.
Just to add to that, I've got a client who works on big tender processes that would run for 1 to 2 months at a period, and they have a couple hundred people working on those tender processes, and they're working 60-hour, 70-hour weeks. And just to reiterate, it's about giving that permission to take a break. In their instances, they have to force breaks. They have to force you to take time for yourself, because otherwise it won't get taken as well. And then it's also about educating the people managers, the team leaders, to identify and monitor and respond to their individual reports and employees. If you see someone that is struggling, pull them aside. But they've got to be trained how to have those conversations, how to support them, and give them permission and empowered to send them home an hour early, or tell them not to come in the next morning, and actually have that well-run break that they require.
And I think it just made me think of a study I looked at, of course another study, where they looked at nurses working during the pandemic. So I don't think you could think of any other cohort who were under as much prolonged stress as those nurses. And they obviously couldn't eliminate psychosocial risk to them. But what they did was they worked out, okay, we'll add in extra resources, we'll mandate some time off, we'll give them a lot of acknowledgement for what they're actually doing. We'll acknowledge that they're actually pushing themselves beyond what they should be. I think organisations in the past with wellbeing have really made wellbeing the pursuit of the individual. And that's why I believe in the last year there's been a lot lower engagement with wellbeing initiatives, because I think we've all wised up. Initially we were grateful, yeah, we love all these tips and tricks, but now people are sort of wising up and going, hey, you're just giving me these tips and tricks, but as an organisation you're not actually acknowledging the context, the job design, the job load, the nighttime phone calls. So yeah, I think that's another really exciting thing about this legislation, is it really is going to bring the whole context in. And yes, it is individuals' responsibility, but it's also the organisations owning how they communicate what they do.
Good. That's good stuff there. Anybody else at the back? Dan. All right, I'll give you the mic.
Hi, I'm Dan Ruffino, the MD of Simon & Schuster Australia. A follow-up question to the first one. How does the legislation actually work in practice if the source of the harm is coming from New York or London? Who is responsible? Who pays?
What a great question. Who wants this? We're going to go legal first.
There are a few different answers. There always are, because employees always have different ways of approaching. But if it is the person who's doing the work in New South Wales, it doesn't matter that the harm's coming from New York, it doesn't matter if it comes from London, it doesn't matter if it comes from Alaska. They're doing their work in New South Wales. So your obligation is to ensure that the work is being done in a safe way in New South Wales. So you would consult with New York and say, we don't want to be doing it this way. We have laws here, and we have systems, framework that we put in place, and we need to work in that framework. So that, it depends if there's subsidiaries or wholly on it. there's another answer to that depending on that as well. They might also have some form of liability, but generally it'll be where the person's performing the work is, and those people would be employed by an Australian entity as well. So that's sort of the answer to that.
Do I get fined or does New York get fined?
Well, that would depend on your structure, and there could be some exposure to New York. But yeah, you may get fined because you're not putting the steps in place to stop it. It's interesting that you asked that before. Nick, no, you're not allowed to ask questions. Nick's my business partner. One interesting thing, and it's not your question, but one thing that we're seeing is that, and it's about this, how do you control somebody else? So we've seen a little bit in our practice where, maybe might be safe work itself. It might be the workers' compensation investigator or the workers' compensation people who want to investigate, something that's happened in a workplace. And that of itself can present a hazard for the workers that they want to investigate. So we had one instance where there was a fatality on an agricultural site, and the workers were pretty traumatised by that, and the investigator wanted to come in a couple of times, and we got to the point, after the first time actually, where we said, you had one interview with them, what you're doing is actually exacerbating, their exposure to risk, to harm, and so we're prepared to cooperate with you, but we don't want to do anything unnecessary. So we're seeing that, we're doing that a little bit too, because sometimes the way that those investigations are conducted by the workers' comp investigators is without regard to the people that they're the witnesses. Ironically now, we're seeing a lot in the psychological health space, and they seem to have little regard to the psychological health of the witnesses.
Just a quick question on that as well, sorry. Psychological safety we've heard a lot about over the last few years, and obviously now we're hearing about psychosocial risks and hazards and regulations. What's the difference between the two?
Do you want to do it?
I'll do psych safety. So psych safety in a nutshell is just feeling safe to be you, talk up, voice an opinion, have a difference in the workplace. So it's quite different to psychosocial risks. I think we all get what psychosocial risks are. Do you?
Don't really see that. I really wanted to clarify. I don't know if anyone else in the room is a bit confused by that, but I was in the beginning.
Paul Kirby from Kirby McClintock. My question to the panel is, in relation to general workplaces, some people are already in the organisation, they could already be exposed. Does this mean now, as part of the risk management process, that people could be compelled to do psych evaluations in line with their current work environment, even if they don't want to?
The code doesn't require that. I haven't seen anything in the code that says that you need to do psych evaluations. What you need to do is take into account that someone may have some vulnerability, or someone might react differently. So they're I'm not a psychologist here, but the way that they deal with things might be.
Yeah, if they've got trauma and then they're exposed to additional trauma, they're going to have a much bigger reaction.
But so you do need to take that into account. So I don't think, and you asked me a question before, I don't think that the answer, I don't think that you, I don't think you would be justified in just doing that. Certainly under the code, you wouldn't be able to say, well, we're doing this under the code, because you have to also minimise, their risk to the hazards. So your survey might disclose some, people might disclose things in the surveys. People might disclose things in conversations, in consultation. They might say, I have this predisposition to trauma, for example, and we'll be putting them in it. Because it depends on
So can I just follow on from that? So in my work as an investigator, we're generally dealing with high conflicts, high impacts, people are very stressed. That's from an external agency point of view. But internally, you've got HR managers as well that are totally engaged with people with all their various traumas, they're constantly being exposed to workplace conflict. So in the work environment, we've got HR managers, for instance, that are constantly being exposed to workplace conflict, and that it does take a toll. We're dealing with crises all the time.
Yeah. So for those people, you would identify in that cohort that is a hazard, the nature of their work.
And that's when I said earlier that, you know, you can't just put a one size fits all across your whole organisation, that you do need to look at different work groups, potentially individuals. So you would need to say, okay, these people are exposed by the nature of their work to these hazards. So that's like high emotion, you know, high emotionally demanding work. So that of itself is a hazard. So then you need to, what measures can we put in place to control that risk of harm to them?
Do you mind if I ask, I'll just use outside voice. Vince O'Neill, Stanford Brand. A natural extension to that is we're talking about a scenario where, let's say, an average person is put in a high-stress situation. What about, the reality is in any of our organisations, they're not all average people. We've got some people that have got a whole variety of history and mental health challenges that they might bring with them. Where's the line of the obligation on an organisation when we know someone is much more vulnerable to what otherwise would not cause psychological harm to, let's say, the average person, but does to them? What's the realistic expectations or obligations in an organisation to try and cap that? And at what point are we better to actually remove them rather than make them try and continue to expose them to a scenario that for most people is fine, but for them they can't cope with?
I think
I'll say
disability discrimination, don't remove them.
Yeah.
I say remove them, but again, what's the reality of a scenario that somebody can't cope with what everyone else in the organisation can cope with on a daily basis?
Yeah, and we see that a lot.
Yeah, I think the code of practice, it states that you have to take people's underlying conditions into account when you're looking at controls. So I had someone recently who had an employee who had quite significant social phobia, as well as anxiety, that didn't exactly sort of her job description. What we ended up doing was referring that person for a psych evaluation from the perspective of job design, so that was then reported back to the employer. This is the sort of job design and this is the sort of pathway you could take to potentially get that employee back to be able to perform that job description.
You're redesigning the role though for the individual.
Yes, yeah, but that's the code of practice. That's what it is.
Alan.
And if they don't disclose a previous employer or vulnerability?
So are you talking about if they don't disclose before they take the job, or?
Yes.
I think it doesn't matter. It's once you know, at that point where you know they have an issue, the duty that comes into play. But I'm not a lawyer, so.
I mean, I see a hand up over
No,
here.
you're also saying they might not know.
We are going to let you speak.
Lisa's trying to bear me from asking a question, but it's picking up on Paul's comment and the question over here. My concern, and again, I'm a cynical employment lawyer dealing with queries from usually organisations about all of these things which are overwhelming. But my concern is an unintended consequence of, and I think Martine said, there needs to be an awareness of individuals who have particular vulnerabilities or mental health conditions. Employers now need to proactively become aware of these issues. My concern is an unintended consequence of this is you'll have employers saying, now that I know about it, there's a possibility that I can contrive this so that I can say, you can't perform the inherent requirements of the job now because you've said you don't deal with stressful situations well. And Lisa pointed out, yes, there's discrimination laws that prohibit that, but the discrimination laws also say that it's not unlawful to terminate someone or discriminate against someone on the basis of a disability if they can't perform the inherent requirements of the job. So I think all of this is well-meaning, but my concern, just knowing the organisational mindset, is that it might actually result in more adverse consequences for some of those people that have mental health conditions. It's like the survey issue. Surveys are great conceptually, but when you've got anonymous surveys, you'll have a lot of organisations that will say, do I want to ask my employees whether or not they think they're working too hard? So this is the complexity. Like I said to my colleague here, we're going to be very busy dealing with this stuff, but coming up with a proactive response to these framework is really challenging.
Yeah, and just on that survey piece, we hear all the time that employees are sick of filling out surveys. And they're often not truthful and they don't trust.
Psychosocial hazard.
It's a psychosocial hazard.
Well, I actually got one yesterday, someone got too many DocuSign reminders. And
That was Martine.
But what he says interestingly picks up on the point of redesigning the role, because this is where we are going to get a whole lot of issues. It's Pandora's box, because as soon as you say someone redesigning this role, because we think that you have got, you know, a vulnerability here and you can't deal with X, Y, and Z, you're going to say, no, I'm okay to do it. Here's my doctor says I'm
That's exactly
fine.
what you get, yeah.
And, you know, I want to do it. And, yeah, so I don't have the answers, but it's going to be really difficult to manage.
And how do you manage if you've got thousands and, you know, you're a CBO or a Google, or there's some organisations here in the room with thousands and thousands of employees. How do you mitigate? Yeah, it's going to be a journey, I think. I'm going to come over to Amy because she's had her hand up a few times.
Thank you. I work in the generalist HR space, and this is really complicated, right? And I think for generalist HR professionals, the expectation on us to understand these things, know when to put in an intervention with a team, that individual is on the rise very quickly. And a couple of times you've mentioned having, you know, with investigations, it needs to be someone who's been trained and well equipped to deal with these things. I just wondered if you had any guidance or recommendations on how we upskill in this area, because I think it's just becoming an expectation, but we've never taken a step back and said, actually, have we been properly trained to effectively deal with these sorts of issues and complexities, and know when to intervene, when to change a role description because somebody has a mental health condition, etc. So any recommendations that you have on really good quality training?
Anyone in the panel? Yep.
Without singing our own tune, but I think obviously, you know, you've got your mental health first aid, but I think HR in particular, they're now almost in a position where they need, you know, a counselling degree or a psychology degree. So we do run essentially 101 counselling skills training, in particular for anyone working with people and leading people, because it's not only the HR and P&C, it's anyone who's a people leader. There's an expectation and there's now an obligation for them to be able to identify and help these people manage and potentially eliminate these psychosocial hazards. So yeah, you've not only got to train people on what their obligation is, you've absolutely got to upskill them with things like, okay, well, how do I lighten my emotional load? Because, you know, you're human beings, you're sponges absorbing other people's, you know, emotions all day. How does anyone leading people sort of lighten that load at the end of the day? Let alone have the skills to be able to manage it in others. So yeah, we find more and more those are the leadership skills. I think I gave a leadership development program last year, and the three of the skills were in that domain.
I don't know how good it is, but I think the regulators, like Safe Work, does have some online training modules, and there's some videos. So, you know, it's a starting point. I wouldn't, you know, it's probably not great, but it's a starting point. They've sort of finished their education phase on this stuff on the code now, and they will move into enforcement. But I think from time to time they do sort of an online, you know, training sessions with people, but they also have those, you know, online modules. So if you have a look at their website, there'll be a little bit of stuff there just to get you started, I think, and then you know what you're looking for as well. But look, the other thing we've sort of done, we are talking to organisations, more tailored, you know, approach to them, and depending on what the nature of their business is. But I think it's, you know, it is, there's a lot in this, and it's very difficult for people, you know, to really get their
around. And there's a lot to do. If you're doing generalist HR, there's a lot to do. You've got to, look at, has everyone got a job description? Is it up to date? Does it fit with what, exactly what they're doing? You've got to go back to those basics. Are our policies all compliant? What have we got? A risk register? Have we got incident notification procedures? You've got to go back through all of that stuff as well before you even get to some of these more difficult questions that we've been talking about.
One quick thing. We're 50 employees, so we're not a massive company, but what we do on a regular basis is we've got 2 stages in the moment. We've got our emerging leaders, and there's a set education program to teach them how to develop and how to become leaders in the business. One of that is how to have these conversations, how to develop these issues, and what to do with them. And then secondly, we've got our actual leader program. So anyone who actually manages people within the business needs to attend this program on an annual basis, and it refreshes the skills to identify what the frameworks are and what resources they've got to help support. So my feeling is that this is just solidifying that every business needs to have this as a standard, that it built into the training program. It's a module that needs to be done on a regular basis.
It's essential leadership capability, and that's why Stanford ran one best place to work.
I was going to say the best place to work, under 100 employees. Yes, Tamara, Altus Property. You can tell everyone that.
Hello, Tamara from Altus. Now Bearings, actually. We just got taken over by Bearings a few months ago. So just a quick question, and probably get booed for this question, but workplace health and safety has a typical defence line in terms of, due diligence and measures and that sort of stuff. Does this fall under the same kind of defence mechanisms that you can use if you are defending a claim against this?
It does. So it's all steps reasonably practicable. So what you have to show is that you did take all steps reasonably practicable. So that's where you reference the code and you say, we achieve the standard in the code. So that would be, in a nutshell, that is what your defence would be. So we did everything we could do.
That's where you need all that documentation.
And apparently Victoria are going to need more than New South Wales.
If you're over 50.
If you're over 50 employees, yeah. And it just seems like it's so industry specific, even though there's lots of general resources from, say, both Work Australia and New South Wales and Queensland and WA, but it's going to be very specific to each industry. So it gives you a baseline, but that's why that consulting and advisory piece and just getting the board really integrated with it all is so important. What are we at for time, and have we got any more questions? We've got a bit more time?
I'll just say one thing we haven't touched on is how we control other companies we're dealing with, their behaviour. Because we have a duty to protect our employees from the behaviour of the people that they're dealing with. So I'd be interested in anybody's thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think an interesting one, we work quite a lot in media and advertising, creative agencies, and often the media agency is being dictated to by the client, and the client doesn't seem to have much empathy and understanding for what's going on. And with the skill shortages we've got at the moment, particularly in media, there's a lot of gaps in people's teams, and people are working ridiculous hours, but the client keeps asking and changing timelines, and there seems a real lack of respect. Sorry if anyone's a client dealing with media agencies. But that's just one example. Has anyone else got something they could share?
It's probably the case as a landlord. So we're a landlord business. We manage commercial, industrial property, by example. And so we're always mindful of the workplace health and safety laws around the buildings. So I guess, without having had the benefit of advice, I would assume though that this just falls into that category, and we have to be mindful of it and proactive.
I mean, what does that look like practically? Does it mean that organisations have to then inform their clients that there's a new code, this is the new regulations? How does, what will they have to share with them?
Maybe have a code of conduct. I know in media there's some sort of collective where they're trying to put together a standard code of conduct around this. So things like that, your industry organisations would be really useful in putting those sorts of codes together.
I think you go back to also consultation is a key thing. So with where it's still, you know, customers, supply chain, you can probably have consultation with them. A lot of organisations will send out, you know, these are our sort of our terms, they build it into our terms. It's a big thing with US companies, I think in particular. Some of you would have seen it where it's like, this is our expectation if you're going to do work with us. But, you know, I'm a lawyer. It's very, very hard in professional services to, you know, control a lot of the deadlines, and probably the worst deadline we ever had, or that I've ever experienced, was working on the Banking Royal Commission, and that was imposed by a judge, former High Court judge, giving us, you know, a day to produce stuff. So you get the notice on Friday to produce on Saturday. So, you know, it can be really, really difficult. So I think it's going to be a challenge for everybody to control, you know, their customers, per se, depending on what you do. But it'll eventually change, and it'll change when this becomes more well known and when people realise that there is sort of some form of liability for their behaviours.
Maybe think of something in government and how that's going to play out there, because obviously it's come from Safe Work Australia, but we work a lot with government, and often we're working with the senior leaders around positive role modelling, positive wellbeing behaviours for themselves and their teams. And then the minister comes in, and the minister doesn't give a shit, to be perfectly honest, about the wellbeing. So I wonder how that's going to play out. It will be really interesting to see how government is going to manage the ministers and how they interact with them and their expectations. That's the question. Can we come over? I'm sure they do care. It's probably a bit harsh, but not a lot.
Phil Taylor. I just want to really support what Lisa was saying, and I think, you know, being probably one of the older people in the room, if you look back 20, 30 years ago, it was acceptable to have a secretary sitting on your lap and whatever the case may be. All those practices were quite acceptable in the good old days. But, you know, society has moved on, right? And I think society will move on with this, and deadlines is just another thing that they'll have to come up with. And I remember a very long time ago, it was such with Bruce, we were in court and setting a date for final hearings, and a senior counsel was looking at it, judging all the, you know, all the diaries were being sorted out, came to a date, and it didn't suit the particular senior counsel, and he said, well, I can't do that date, I'm sorry. And the judge looked at him and said, well, why? And it wasn't because he had some sort of executive meeting or whatever, he had a father-son breakfast the next day. And he actually just called it out. He said, I can't do it. Got a father-son breakfast at school. Judge went, okay, let's find another day. So it does evolve, and I think my message really in a long-winded way is, you know, society will change and workplaces will change, and I think that we, you know, needn't be alarmed about it. I think it will actually move itself through. And if you have authenticity in your messaging, and you have a client saying, no, I want it tomorrow morning, and lots of government clients say they want it tomorrow morning, you know it's not going to do anything until, you know, 2 weeks away. So push back respectfully. I think that you'll be respected for it.
Yeah, great. And I think that's what these regulations do. They give people permission to push back, which is a real positive. Any more questions in the room? Anyone? Lenka? Anyone else over here before I move over there? No? Okay. And what do we have time-wise? Okay. All right, this is our last question. Better be good. No questions?
Well, so these regulations are put in place in order to protect the individual. How might we make sure that the organizations don't push the responsibility back on the individual by making the recruiting process really hard and making people disclose their psychological conditions, and then in the final effect, people refuse to go see a psychologist because they worry it will turn out somewhere on their, you know, like when you're applying for a life insurance, you get really scrutinized for every broken toe. How might we best prevent this, and what is what is an employee allowed to do today to require this information, and to what extent will the individual be protected to not disclose? But it needs to be fair because then the employer needs to then, redesign the job description. There's cost associated, and that's true.
Good question. I think we've seen that in the medical profession a lot, where doctors and nurses don't tend to see psychologists because, again, it can go on their record and impact their insurances. So they often suffer in silence or self-medicate or whatever is going on there. But I'm going to pass that question over to Lisa.
Yeah, sort of just from the perspective, the discrimination perspective that we were talking about earlier, you can't, you're not supposed to be asking that. I mean, sometimes you can go and have a psych evaluation, but generally what you can't do is not offer the person a role because they have psychological history, unless, of course, it means that they can't fulfil the inherent requirements of the job. So if someone's applying for a job, they might have a post-traumatic stress disorder from working, say, that woman who worked for the Office of Public Prosecutions, that kind of issue. But she wants to apply for a different type of role in an organisation, or a different type, wants to do a different type of law that doesn't have that same risk. Then you can't not offer the job to that person because of their history. So there are some laws in place to protect. There's also general protections regime, the Fair Work Commission, so someone could bring a claim there too if prospective employees can bring those claims if they're not offered a job for those reasons. But in terms of people not getting the appropriate help, or that may well be a byproduct of this. And I think what happens with these things too, recommendations are made and everybody gets on board and says yes, we need to do that. But then you get to a point where you might just be going too far, and that may be what's happening. Now, can I just say one thing before we go? It's been great to see people in a session like this. So thank you so much, everybody, for leaving your offices or your home offices and coming. And the second thing is, I'm sure that the Scandinavians leave work happier because they have drinks in the afternoon.
Saunas and ice baths. Yes, look, thank you everyone for coming. Next steps are you're going to receive a bit of a pack from us, which is going to have the slides, it's going to have some resources and a bit more information. And please feel free to get in touch with us. We've got a few cards on the table here, business cards, but you'll also have the details of everybody here on the panel, so you can reach out to them individually if you'd like to. I'm going to pass the mic around just so you can say goodbye.
Thank you very much. It's been great to actually be face-to-face again, and reiterate thank you to Tao for letting us use their offices. It's a great venue, and it was very generous of them, so thank you.
Love the engagement, love the questions, and I think we started by saying we wouldn't have all the answers, and I think we need to remind ourselves to drop our need for perfection, even when it comes to complying with this legislation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a learning process for everyone. So we're here to help, and thanks again. Thanks for Stanford Brown, Henry Whittam Lawyers, and Select Wellness. And there's more food, please help yourselves.